Gender, Youth, Employment, and Social Inclusion, an online course delivered by the African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, IDEP of the UNECA, in collaboration with UN Women and Sharona. Congratulations for completing Module 2. I warmly welcome you to this exciting week 3, where we will be talking about data and knowledge generation on youth and gender equality. As indicated earlier, I'm available to guide you through this process and can be reached via alexijanconsults@gmail.com. Once again, I am Kirika Stella Okonkwo, the course director. Thank you and welcome on board. Module 3, Data and Knowledge Generation on Youth and Gender Equality. This module highlights that gender and age disaggregated data anchored in the real needs and situations of young women and young men is key for achieving gender equality. It emphasizes the need to engage with young women to generate cutting-edge knowledge products and curate knowledge on young men-led initiatives promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. It's expected that at the end of this module, you would have gained deeper understanding on how to use data and knowledge generation as strategies for promoting youth and gender equality. Unlike previous modules, we have decided that for this module, we will be focusing more on data, the data itself, the indicators. When you get the lecture material for Module 3, you will now get the in-depth details on the course content for Module 3. So for this Module 3, we'll be looking at introduction, labor force participation rate in Africa, the labor market trends, the employment trends, the recent trends in youth employment, youth unemployment, and need rate in Africa, COVID-19 and how it's related to or affects youth employment and gender equality in Africa, the gender gap in labor force participation in Africa, state of gender gaps by sub-index, closing gender gaps, global gender gap performance in Africa, gender and age disaggregated data as key to achieving gender equality, data and knowledge generation towards youth empowerment and gender equality, engaging young women in generating cutting-edge knowledge products, curating knowledge on young men-led initiatives promoting gender equality and women empowerment in Africa, strategies for empowering young men and women as partners for gender equality and social inclusion. We also have opportunities to look at some tools that have been developed by the UN for data and knowledge generation towards youth and gender equality and the future of work for youth in post-COVID-19 era. You also have opportunity to get your assignment for Module 3 and then the questions for the e-panel discussion. Introduction. According to African Union 2022, women constitute almost 50% of the African population, but still remain largely underrepresented in leadership roles across financial, investment, and entrepreneurial markets. As a result of these long-standing gender gaps, economic literature shows that Africa loses over 20% of its GDP every year. Africa has progressive normative frameworks that guarantee gender equality in social, economic, and political affairs, yet we are still having these gender gaps. Therefore, ensuring availability and facilitating access to comprehensive and reliable data is pivotal in helping Africa to work towards achieving policy and legal frameworks across the continent. So for this Module 3, we will be leveraging key indicators developed by the World Economic Forum, that's the Global Gender Gap Report 2020 to 2022, as well as other indicators from International Labour Organization, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, among others. For the indicators used in Module 3, more details, as I mentioned earlier, are in the lecture notes. We are looking at the ILO labor participation rates and volume, the Global Gender Gap Index, which measures the extent of gender-based gaps among 4 key dimensions. And these are the indicators we used, also known as the sub-index or dimensions. That is the economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. These indicators are discussed in subsequent slides in order to enable you to understand how to generate and use data and knowledge generation as strategies for promoting youth and gender equality across Africa. And then if there are also relevant data that you have, especially recent ones, we encourage you to feel free to share them. We're also trying not to overload you with so much information, but also trying to bring out what is really relevant at the moment. So we will be happy to receive your inputs on this module. This table 1 shows us the ILO indicators in terms of the total labor force participation from 2000 to 2021. And here are the 2 indicators we are looking at are the labor force participation rate and the volume of labor force participation in million. We can see that for Africa, in terms of labor force participation rates, in 2020, it didn't perform as it would have performed as expected, because it was the same rate for 2019, 2020, and 2021. But you can see that Africa performed better in year 2000, where it had 55.1% in terms of its labor force participation rate. Then for the volume of labor force participation in millions, Africa did better in last year with 518 as against 302.1 that they had in year 2000. And when we now go down to break, you will see the sub-regional indicators for Central Africa, Eastern Africa, Northern Africa, Southern Africa, Western Africa, and also what happens at the world level. And this was computed by the ILO using the ILO modeled estimates of November 2019. Figure 1 here gives us the indicators used by ILO in understanding the employment to population ratio by gender 2021. So the blue color shows us the total, while the red highlights the ratio for men, and the light blue highlights the ratio for women. We can see for Africa, men are performing better in terms of employment to population ratio by gender. The men had 67.5% as against 50.2% for women. And when we look at the sub-regional data, you can see that for North Africa, it was 63.1 for men, 62.4 for women. For Central Africa, we have 68.7 for men, 62.4 for women. For Eastern Africa, the margin was 79.6% for men, and for women, 70.2%. Southern Africa had 47.3% for men and 35.8% for women. If you look at West Africa, the margin is really a bit high when you compare the 60.8% for men and 49.2% for women, showing that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of looking at who gets employed and the employment per population ratio by gender. And so this is also where you come in. When the employment opportunities are there, when we are doing our interventions, we need to begin to look at some of this data. For table 2, we're looking at youth unemployment rate, labor underutilization, LU3 rate, and NEET rates in terms of world and Africa from 2019 to 2022. So when we are looking at youth unemployment rate for Africa, the total percentage for 2022 was 12.7%. And for the males, it was 12.3%. And for the females, it was 13.3%. So I believe you can see where the gaps are. And then for youths, labor underutilization rate, for the female, we don't have, as at the time this module was being prepared, we don't have data for 2021 and 2022. But for 2020, for the males, it was 21.7, and for females, it was 26.0. For the youth NEET rate, for the males, it was 18.2, and for females, 27.8% as at 2000. And then when it comes to defining youth, ILO used the definition of youth as those within the ages of 15 to 24, while the labor underutilization rate refers to the combined rate of youth unemployment and potential labor force. The values in the column for the year 2022 are projections because data was not available as at the time this was computed by ILO. Table 3 gives us a snapshot of the key labor supply indicators across the world and Africa from 2019 to 2022 in terms of the percentage. For the youth labor force participation rate, we can see that the men seem to be doing better with 46.9% in this year, as against 40.9% for the females. Then for the youth employment to population rate, for the men, it was 41.1% and 35.4% for females this year. Again, the definition of youth used by ILO is young people within the ages of 15 to 24, and also highlighting here that this data from ILO was done using the ILO modeled estimates and in November 2021. So the values in the column for year 2022 are more or less projections. Table 4 gives us the indicators as regards gender gap in labor force participation rate. For 2018, it was 17.8 for Africa, and it later dropped to 17.7 in 2019, dropped again in 2020 to 17.6, and as I said, last year it was 17.5, as shown by the ILO 2019 statistics. We now go to the World Economic Forum indicators that show us the state of gender gap in terms of the 4 sub-indexes that I mentioned earlier. That is the Health and Survival Sub-Index, the Educational Attainment Sub-Index, the Economic Participation and Opportunity Sub-Index, and the Political Empowerment Sub-Index. It's important to note here that population-weighted averages, including the 153 economies featured in the Global Gender Gap Index 2020. And from what we can see here, we can see that when it comes to economic participation and opportunity sub-index, that Africa or the world is not doing well because it's at 58% as at the 2020. The same issue, the Global Gender Gap Index stood at 69%, showing that we still have a lot of work to do. And as you can see in subsequent years, 2021 and 2022, really more work needs to be done. For last year, the Global Gender Gap Index stood at 68%, while economic participation and opportunity sub-index stood at 58%, as shown by the Global Gender Gap Index for 2020. 21. In this case, the population weighted averages for 156 economies were used, and they featured in the 2021 Global Gender Gap Index. And I believe at this point you are seeing where the gaps are. We need to learn lessons on how the educational attainment sub-index and the health and survival sub-indexes were able to get to 95 and 96%. And then know the key lessons that we can use to leverage in our advocacy around the economic participation and opportunities sub-index, including the political empowerment and sub-indexes. For 2022, the Global Gender Gap Index stood at 68.1%. You can see that the economic participation and opportunity sub-index stood at 60.3%, as against 94.4% and 95.8% for educational attainment, health and survival sub-indexes, respectively. In terms of political empowerment sub-index, much work really needs to be done. 146 economies had their population weighted averages used in this by the World Economic Forum. This slide gives you a snapshot of the Global Gender Gap Index rankings by region from 2020 to 2022. So what I did was to highlight for Sub-Saharan Africa, and then later in the next slide, you will see for North Africa and Middle East. You can see that 3 countries are really doing very well. That is Namibia, Rwanda, and South Africa. So the question we need to ask, and it will be useful to hear from learners from these countries, how you were able to do this better. How were you able to get to the top 3 in 2020, 2021, and 2022 as regards the regional ranking? And then the performance for Namibia at the global level is Namibia stands at position 8 at the moment, while Rwanda stands at position 6, and South Africa position 20. You can also see the score. Their scores, their various scores for each of the years under review. This is a continuation of Sub-Saharan Africa. You can see that for Comoros, we don't have the data for 2021, 2020. Yes, both at the regional and the global level. We have for 2022 at the regional level, Comoros stands at 32 position. So most of these countries still need to come up in terms of their performance. For North Africa, East, and Middle East, the data shown here by the World Economic Forum reveals that Tunisia is leading in the regional ranking, coming 4th for this year and 3rd last year. For Egypt, Egypt is on 7th position for the regional ranking, while Mauritania, there's no data for this year in the regional ranking. For the global level, Tunisia stands at 120, and we believe that more work still needs to be done for all these countries across Africa to step up, and for those that are already doing well to see how they can sustain and build on the momentum sustained already. This time we'll be looking at some of the tools for data and knowledge generation on youth and gender equality. We will start with the African Gender and Development Index, which was launched in 2004 with 3 main objectives: to provide African governments with data and information on the status of gender equality and the effects of their gender policies in tackling women's marginalization, to provide African governments with an African-specific tool to monitor progress made in implementing regional and international resolutions on gender equality and women's empowerment, and to provide African governments with not only quantitative statistics, but also qualitative ones, so as to measure both quantitative and qualitative progress. The African Gender and Development Index has 4 phases that it identified. Most of the countries fall within the 4 phases. For the first phase, we have 12 countries: Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Egypt, Ghana, Madagascar, Mozambique, South Africa, Tanzania, Tunisia, Uganda. For phase 2, we have Botswana, Burundi, Cabo Verde, Congo Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Gambia, Kenya, Malawi, Mali, Senegal, Togo, Zambia. For phase 3, we have 10 countries: Eswatini, Guinea, Liberia, Niger, Namibia, Rwanda, Seychelles, South Africa, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe. While for phase 4, the countries are 5: Sao Tome and Principe, Mauritius, Mauritania, Chad, and Guinea-Bissau. The second tool we'll be looking at is the Gender Status Index, GSI, which was developed as the quantitative part of the AGDI. It provides a quantitative assessment of gender equality and has 7 components, 11 subcomponents, and 44 indicators. In its computation, the indicator for gender equality for most variables is calculated as comparison, that is ratio of female achievement versus male achievement. The closer the indicator is to 1, the better the performance on gender equality is in the country. And so to allow for small variations in indicator values, gender parity is usually assumed to exist as GSI values between 0.97 and 1.03. And what this means is that when GSI is less than 0.97, it reveals the gender disparity in favor of males. But when GSI, the gender status index, is greater than 1.03, it reveals the gender disparity in favor of females. Also worthy of note is that in GSI weighting, the GSI for each subcomponent, component, and block is calculated as a simple arithmetic mean of respectively the indicators, subcomponents, and components. If an indicator is missing, the other indicators of the subcomponents and components are reweighted to take account of the actual number of available indicators. Also important to note is that the overall GSI is equal to the overall gender profile of the country, which is then compiled as the simple mean of the GSI for the 3 blocks. I believe the statisticians will give us more ideas on this and also share other tools that you are using to promote data and knowledge generation on youth and gender equality. We now come to the African Women's Progress Scoreboard, the AWPS, which focuses on progress made in empowering women without comparing men and women. It has 15 critical areas that it uses in its implementation, and then it captures qualitative issues in relation to the performance of gender policies of African government, as well as assesses the gap between political commitment and implementation of gender policies, which is very important, and that is what is really needed at the African level. AWPS uses a simple scoring system that is based on a 3-point score scale. So when it's 0-0, it indicates no action. When it's 0-1, it indicates partial action. And when it's 0-2, it indicates full action. We now come to the UNHCR African Development Bank African Gender Index, which is seen at the moment as the most comprehensive measure of the state of gender equality across 51 of the 54 African countries. The Africa Gender Index highlights the progress made in closing gender gaps in education and health, jobs and wages, and political participation and leadership. So you can see that these are the indicators that it monitors. It provides governments and partners with reliable data, key to developing evidence-based reforms, tracking progress, and evaluating the effectiveness of policies to advance gender equality. It also examines three dimensions, that is the social, economic, and representation and empowerment. And you can see that these are closely linked to the three dimensions of sustainable development. It presents solutions for policy measures and investment that can change the status quo and generate gains for all Africans. The highlights from the African Gender Index 2020 has shown that on the social dimension, women continue to be disadvantaged in education and training despite improvements. The economic dimension shows that young women are more likely than young men to be in informal, low-paid, and vulnerable employment, while the representation and empowerment dimension determine that in the private and public sectors, senior decision-making remains mainly in the hands of men, while companies have, and it's shown here that when companies have a greater share of women on their boards, they perform better financially. So the question is, what are we waiting for to get women on board? And what can we do to get young people to also come on board as a way of mentoring them, as a way of on-the-job coaching? For Module 3's further reading list, you have the African Union 2022, 10 practical things to catalyze and accelerate gender equality. You also have UNICEF documents, World Bank, the Global Gender Gap Report for 2020 to 2022. The rest of the further reading list you get when you get the other materials. For this Module 3's assignments, you are to recommend 3 data and knowledge generation strategies that you are familiar with or you know about, or either you've used it or you came across, that you feel that the government of your country and partners in development there can use to effectively promote youth and gender equality. So by this, we want to know what is going on in your country that can also be added to what we have shared already. You are to use the 2022 Global Gender Gap Report and the African Union Gender Scorecard as documents to guide you in preparing the strategies. Remember to submit your one-page strategy document on or before Thursday of this week 3 to me for the Anglophone learners. And for the Francophone learners, kindly send directly to Monsieur Gagnedier's email. This week's group discussion is looking at how we can promote intergenerational partnerships for gender equality and social inclusion across Africa. So here we want to see your creativity. We want to learn from you, your experience, or what you've been doing, or what you know that other organizations you're familiar with are doing to promote social inclusion and partnerships for gender equality. As always, we encourage you to post your comments and also take time to peer review comments from other learners, and do so on or before Friday of this week 3. For your online quiz, when you are ready, please go ahead and take it. Good luck as you proceed. At this point, I want to encourage you to remember to perform all outstanding tasks in previous modules, including Module 3, and then get ready to take your quiz. Congratulations for completing Module 3. And I warmly encourage you to proceed to Module 4, lecture notes and slides. Thank you, and see you next week.